Okay, so this is part 2 where I'm showing you how to go from your base tonal underpainting that I've talked about, where it's just establishing some of the loose values. There's not a lot of detail. You don't have all the values are not 100% correct, but you can tell kind of compositionally the direction you're going in. Before, when I was working on this, you might have noticed I was working with a really large brush, even as small as this composition is. I'm going to go down just a little bit in the size on my brush to, this is a number 6 or 9. 6. I can't tell for sure. And one of the things that I might go in and do first is I might begin to put in some of my sky color, just because I'm going to be working kind of on top of that. And in this painting, the sky is, it's kind of muted. And so, oh yeah, and one other thing that's really important, I have my full array of colors out ready to mix. I have my reds, my yellows, 2 piles of white, and I'll explain that some other time, and my 2 different blues. I've got the green, but I may not use that green a lot because that phthalo green is insanely bright. And I have a little bit of brown, even though there's a lot of brown in the painting. In terms of the tree trunks, I actually like to mix my brown more than use the umber, because I think there's a tendency to default to just something a little bit too generic for my taste. Okay, so I am beginning to lay in a little bit of the white with just a hint. See, that's too blue. That's not generally the sky blue, and certainly not in that photo. And I'm wanting to really get something that feels similar in value and level of saturation and intensity to that sky in there. Sometimes I'll add a tiniest little bit of yellow to my sky blue because it creates a little warmth and luminosity. Because like with the sky, see, I like this color better than that blue, which is so cold. And so I added the tiniest little bit of yellow. And that's my personal taste because I like the warmth, so it feels like light and luminosity. So this first part that I put in, that I'm using the ultramarine blue, and I think it feels too cold for my taste, and so I'm coming in with a little more. And you'll notice I'm kind of covering up my trees a little bit. And I'm overlapping some of my ground down here, and there's a reason for that, and you'll see that as I build this up a little bit more. And I want to get some over here. A lot of this is covered, but not all of it. And I'll come back in and detail this, but for these exercises, I really want you to work fairly quickly in terms of establishing that sense of light and exploring the expressive potential of your brushwork and working on your color mixing and trying to, get a more kind of controlled sense of that. And you'll notice I'm going back and getting a second layer over some of that. And I'm overlapping my trees because they were actually too big. And so, I knew I was going to be doing that. And that's totally fine, but I kind of know where they end and begin. And I'm going to overlap my distant tree row because the edges are going to be kind of soft in there as well. And I gotta come in here. It's kind of awkward on mine because the way the top of my easel is kind of weird. It obscures a tiny little panel like this. Okay, so I have my sky, Now I'm gonna actually keep working in that same little pile, and I'm gonna create my kind of gray green. You see, that's too, I think that's too blue for me because it feels too much like the sky. So I'm gonna add in some more yellow. And then this color that I just made right here feels more like what's kind of happening in some of these areas. So I might actually lay that in. I was trying to make that color there, but you know what my thing is? If I make the color and I'm like, oh, that color actually looks nice in this other area, I'm gonna add it in that area while I have it. And I may end up getting a little brighter here. But this is a good, this is a good first layer, kind of getting in there. And I'm sort of working around those little fence posts, but I may just obscure over them. I think that'll be more efficient. I'm going to obscure over my trees there. I'll come back and get those. And notice I'm avoiding my shadows because I'm going to come in to those with a separate puzzle piece. And I'm going to get in at least a first layer here. I think it's going to end up being a little more yellow in that area. This may be too yellow, but we'll get that figured out as those layers get developed. And that's why, it really is much more interesting if you don't get it right the first time, but instead you allow the layering to happen. And that's what gives you that sense of light happening in there. And this is back in the distance. The light's starting to happen back there. It's probably not going to be quite as light over here, but I like some of this luminosity kind of peeking in every once in a while. In that area, as it gets further into the distance, sometimes it gets lighter, sometimes it gets grayer. That's probably popping too much for back there. So probably need to dull that down a little bit, but it still needs to feel kind of connected. And then here it's kind of washed out a little bit, not quite as vibrant. Some of this in here. Let's see what happens with that. I may end up changing that. There's some duller colors in here along with some of those brighter colors. And just that starts to layering that in. Okay, now I'm going to try and get back to what I was originally doing over here, which is that distant tree area. And that area is always going to be a little softer and a little duller than you might initially think it is or could be or should be. Because it's, in order for it to kind of feel like it's sinking back, it is going to be cooler in tone, those distant areas, than the things that are up close. And so I'm kind of working in between some of my trees here. And I'm still using a pretty large brush. It's, I'm not trying to get control at this point. I'm just going with it, as, and then I'm going to go work in a little darker at the base. It's not getting there yet. It's too mixing with my prior layer. Just cooling that down just a little bit, going just a little darker at the base, adding a little bit of movement in there, not keeping it too precise, so that that kind of sinks back and we have some kind of modeling, but it's not, but I'm not necessarily trying to put precise, you know, tree texture. And at my top edge, because at this top edge is where the light is really leaking through your layers. And so you go with a value that's very close to the sky. And that's what starts to soften that. See, I came down a little too much here, so I'm going to kind of blend that out. But where you can barely tell the difference between sort of the sky and the tree edge right there. And if you look at mine in relation to the photo that you're working from, you'll see that it's not an exact duplication necessarily. Okay, so I want to start laying in a little bit with these trees because they set up some really crucial values. And I am making kind of a dark purplish, brownish, reddish color because of the way that the relationship of light happens. So I'm kind of working in some different values on there. This is getting close to the value because remember that acrylic is going to dry darker than you think it should. It could. And I, you know, might do better with a little thinner brush. Or either just kind of making sure I'm using maybe a different shape brush. I probably need a round. I usually would use a round for those lines. So I'll come in and, you know, I've been doing this long enough that I can create those lines and do pretty well. You know, not perfect, but in a way that I feel pretty good about. So I've got this little branch and some other branches. And they're, you know, we want to see the branches as the same value as that central trunk, but it's not because the light leaks around it more. And so it actually ends up working more effectively if you make the branches a little tiny bit lighter. And I'm going to get that tree trunk in there. It's got to come down. And one of the perspective things you got to keep in mind is notice where the tree, you know, kind of ends and begins. Like a lot of times, I'm getting some drip marks there, but that's fine. A lot of times we want to see that we think the tree trunk is on the horizon line. It's not on the horizon line. It's somewhere below the horizon line because it's sitting closer to it. The horizon line back there, which is this line here, is pretty far away. I need a little bit thicker paint in order to get some coverage that I want. And so I'm continuing. I needed to kind of beef up my pile of paint that I'm using as my sort of brown color. And